Steve's here.
Hello, David, Mary. I think Nadine, you're there too.
Hey, yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great.
Enjoying the hot weather?
No. Wisconsin sounds good right now. Of
Yeah. You know the what though, this
course, they
time of
may
year
have it too.
it gets hot
What
up
was
there
that?
this time of year too, though. In fact, surprisingly enough, Wisconsin can get hot and humid.
Yeah. We were up there a couple years ago for a family reunion around the 4th, and it was like 80 degrees with hardly any humidity, and that was like nice.
Well, Joe is here with us from Nebraska.
Oh, hey, Joe.
Yeah, he's
Is
not,
he
I'm
ready to go?
outside.
Is he
Yeah,
ready to go, Jordan?
well,
Is he going to Jordan? I don't know if he heard.
late Saturday night, but it's been can't get out of the place. Bombs
Oh,
flying everywhere.
oh,
Oh, it's like the national anthem, bombs
I,
bursting in air.
I
And
didn't hear the first part of what you said because it's you froze up. But
oh,
are they
okay.
in
Well,
Jordan now and can't get out?
yeah, Trisha can't get out. Um,
Oh,
she would really like to. She used to be swatted because of the mosquitoes, but the yeah, I mean, Trisha has her team over there, her students, and she's stuck, and she's got to get. They had. I mean, Joe today. I don't know where the university is in this. The university should be taking care of these things, but Joe had ended up buying tickets for everybody to get out of there
Oh,
wow,
no.
because
wow.
Trisha can't leave. I mean, she doesn't want to leave her students there and say good luck. So
You don't want to do that.
yeah. So anyway, um, yeah, it's been pretty bad, and of course, uh, you can just sympathize with the people over there. I mean, obviously sympathize with Trisha, but all these people, the bombs flying everywhere, especially in Israel and Jordan, you're a little bit safer because they're not specifically aiming at you. Even though the Jordanian, I mean, the Jordanian military is participating, they're shooting this stuff down. So, I mean, she goes out and sends us pictures of this stuff falling out of the air.
Oh, wow.
Well, let's get started. And this is kind of intriguing topic. So let's see where we go with this. And which Ten Commandments? Which ones are the real ones? Uh, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity of coming together. We ask that you'll be with us as we explore the Bible a little more in depth and gain a little better understanding of the Bible, how it came together, and how we are to relate to it. So be with us now as we embark on this particular study about the Ten Commandments. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so here we go. Now let me ask you before we even dig into the topic. When we ask the question, which Ten Commandments are the real ones? What's your immediate reaction?
There's more than one.
Okay.
But also, after I started researching I definitely found, some stuff that I didn't know about, you know, as far as different versions, I guess, but they all ultimately come down to the same conclusion, I believe.
And
Yeah.
aren't they given twice, like in Exodus and then in Deuteronomy?
Yeah. And
But I think they're about the same, except they add a little bit of nuance to the like fourth commandment, I think. The reason for it.
but there's actually two
Yeah.
different places in Exodus. My paper go.
Okay. Let me do something. You guys are breaking up. David, you told me I was breaking up some. I'm gonna stop the screen share for just a minute. And I'm going to switch over to a different system. And let's hopefully that will work.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. I switched over to I have two systems that I work with. One is the satellite, and it usually works well, except the park that we were in had no water and no electricity. And so they got the electricity back on. Well, actually, what happened was they got we didn't have electricity the first day, and then they got the electricity back on. And then the next day, we had no water or electricity. So we said, we're out of here. So we had to move to a different park. And
Wow.
I'm always careful to get one where the satellite's not obstructed by the trees. And it may be that that one's a little bit obstructed. So anyway, I switched over to the other system. Let me go back to the share, and I think we'll be okay. Can you hear me okay and everything now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good deal. All right. So let's dig into the thank you for your impressions, by the way. And I think you're right on track. So let's see what we can make all of the about all of this. Just remind us once again of this quotation. I think it's a good guiding point, and all of you can go to the Great Controversy and read it. But I think it's really a good statement about how to approach the Bible. But here's just one little piece of it, and we review this every week, so you probably have it memorized by now. Anyway, the Bible points to God as its author, yet it was written by human hands. And in the varied styles of its different books, it presents the characteristics of the several writers. So all of us know that's true. It doesn't take a genius to look at the Bible and to see that, even in English. But it's more apparent, of course, when you look at it in the original language. All right, so let's go to the Ten Commandments. Now, when we talk about the Ten Commandments, the first thing that comes to mind is Exodus. And we know that in Exodus 20, we have what we refer to, of course, as the Ten Commandments. Now, what you may find interesting about this is the Ten Commandments are actually called the 10 words. And I think I probably have mentioned that before. But when in Exodus, Deuteronomy, back in the writings of Moses, when it refers to the Ten Commandments, it calls them the 10 words. It also associates them with being a covenant. Now, a covenant in the Old Testament was simply a legal agreement. And so here we have a legal agreement between God and the people of Israel. All right. So here we go. It says, and God spoke all of these words, saying, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The Ten Commandments, interestingly enough, is somewhat like the ancient treaties that a king would have over a vassal king. They would have to form an agreement. One king conquers another one, but leaves that king on the throne, and they enter into an agreement. And so the statements here are kind of similar to that. We see it organized in sort of the same way. So God says, I've rescued you from slavery. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And therefore, because I brought you out of the land of Egypt, I am Yahweh your God. You shall have no other gods before me. So you see the connection. God says, I have this legal agreement with you. I rescued you. I saved you. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, you're mine. You're my people. And I am your God. So don't, don't violate that relationship and go seeking other gods because I'm your God. I'm the one that rescued you. And so turning away to a different God would mean that they were now saying that God, that Yahweh did not rescue them, and they were denying him, and so forth and so on. So he starts right out. So the first one just simply flows from what we would call the preamble. Now, keep in mind, the Bible talks about the 10 words, as we translate that, the 10 commandments. So we look for 10. But all the divisions of the text, none of those were in the Bible originally. Those are all added at more modern times. And so what we have then is this just flows, it's one smooth thing. So you could easily, say that this is actually part of the first commandment if you wanted to. But in any case, you shall have no other gods before me. Then what we would call number two, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, the earth beneath, or the water that's under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them or serve them, for I am Yahweh, your God. I'm a jealous God. As we mentioned earlier, he rescued them. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers unto the third and fourth generations of those that hate me, showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. All right, all of us know the 10 commandments. Now, it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. All right, for the Lord will not, in other words, God, this is an interesting one. Some of these commandments in our time are a little bit hard for us to wrap our head around. But in vain means simply chasing after the wind. That would be the literal translation. So you shall not use the name of Yahweh your God like you're chasing after the wind. In other words, in a meaningless way. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day it's the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Now, by the way, I didn't point something out to you that I should have pointed out to you, but I'll just mention it. We'll see it more when we come to the next table, the 10 commandments, or the next set of commandments. And that is the first two commandments are written in the first person. God says, I am, for instance, the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. The rest of it now changes that tense. And so now it's a story that God is telling, not a direct conversation. So you see, when it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, God doesn't say, you shall not take my name in vain. In the first two commandments, it was, I am the Lord your God. And, you would expect now in this commandment that it would flow the same way. You shall not take my name in vain, but it's not. So it switches now to the third person. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. By the way, let me stop again because you might ask, well, why is that the case? I have no idea. People argue about that a lot. Why the change there, from first person to third person? I don't know. I guess it's speculation on the part of any of us. Okay, but remember the Sabbath day to keep holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. Once again, third person there, as you can see. He doesn't say the seventh day is my Sabbath, keep it holy. Now it's the third person being addressed. So it's a story that's being told about God rather than God actually addressing the people. Okay, now let's continue on. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. Only you shall not do any work, your son or daughter, male servant, female servant. Okay, so we're familiar with that. Now notice the reason for keeping the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that in them is. Rest of the seventh day, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. All right, once again, we have this memorized. We know this. Now, in Exodus, this is usually the set of the 10 commandments that we say that's the real 10 commandments. All right, so let's keep that in mind. Let's explore that. But if you have one set of commandments that's the real one, what does that make the next? So we have to kind of, say, okay, where are we going with all of this? But keep it in mind. Honor your father and mother that your days may be long in the land. This is a little bit different from the other commandments that are given in Deuteronomy. Here it says that your days may be long. You'll see this translation that I'm looking at actually translates it the same way, even though the wording is different. So the wording here is changed. And in Deuteronomy, as we'll know when we go through there, it says extended. So, you have a allotted amount of days, but we'll give you more. Here it just says, that you'll have a long life. I mean, they're somewhat similar. I mentioned that on Sabbath, but that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. Now, here I put this in yellow. This is different somewhat also. And I'll ask you when we go through the next table of the Ten Commandments or the next Ten Commandments that remember some of these differences, and maybe you can point those out as we go along. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, we notice that there's several things referred to here. One, in this particular case, it mentions slaves. Okay. And so you say, well, why are the slaves mentioned in the Ten Commandments? It's obviously property here that refers to in this last commandment. And we also see, and I've pointed this out before, this is in descending order of value. So your house is more valuable than the wife, and a male servant in that economy is more valuable than a female servant. In fact, actually, in the writings of Moses, there's an actual cash value placed on those. A male servant, and then the female servant, or an ox, which is a more valuable animal, of course, than a donkey, or anything else that's your neighbor's. All right. So that is the first table of the Ten Commandments. So now let's go to the next table of the Ten Commandments. And we see that we have this rendered like this. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Now, this is Moses, and they're getting ready to enter the promised land. This is shortly before the death of Moses. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb, not with our fathers. By the way, it's interesting, and we don't know why, but sometimes the mountain is referred to as Sinai, sometimes it's referred to as Horeb. Why, we don't know. But anyway, that's the case. That's the way it is. So here, the mountain is Horeb, not Sinai. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant. Now, this is an interesting statement. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Now, you may remember that the first time that we see the Ten Commandments occurring back in the book of Exodus was at Mount Sinai, shortly after the people had come out of captivity. Now what we see is what's taking place 40 years after that. And all the people that were at Mount Sinai had died, except for Caleb and Joshua. Once again, these are all things that we're familiar with. But now it says not that God made a covenant with us at Horeb, not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us are alive here today. Now that's kind of interesting wording, and I'm not sure exactly what that means. But we run across these things in the Bible sometimes, and we have to scratch our heads, and we don't always have an answer for it. But we accept it the way that it is. Now, it may be that what God was saying was those people that refused to enter in the promised land, they all died in the wilderness. So maybe God is simply saying here, my covenant was not with them, they broke it, but my covenant now is actually with you. So that may be one way to look at it. So anyway, it continues on. The Lord Yahweh spoke with you face to face in the mountain out of the midst of fire, while I stood between Yahweh and you at that time to declare to you the word of Yahweh. For you are afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up into the mountain. He said, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So now Moses is telling the story, but notice here we have the first person going on because he's making a quotation. So here the quotation is, of course, in the first person. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So very similar to what we have back in the book of Exodus. And then he flows right from there. So the established this relationship between God and the people of Israel was based on this covenant made because he brought them out of Egypt. He rescued them. So we see the exact same thing happening here as we saw back in Exodus. So I am Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness in heaven, earth beneath, the water that's under there. Okay, almost identical to Exodus. All right. You shall not bow down yourself to serve them, for, and we see the first person, once again, it's quotation, but it's a first person. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the children of third and fourth generations, showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So now we have this, switching over, we're going back to the third person, just exactly like Exodus. So in that sense, interestingly enough, in Exodus, we have Moses coming down from the mountain, remember, with the 10 Commandments written out. And but even there, the first two were in the first person, as we have seen, and the rest in the third person. But now, 40 years later, Moses is simply quoting the 10 Commandments. Maybe he was reading them. We don't know. But in any case, we see the same formula being followed in both Exodus and here in Leviticus. So we see these similarities. The wording is very similar. Even this change of tense is similar. But there are also some differences, and we'll notice those. You shall not take the name of the Lord God for the Lord in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless. Who takes his name in vain? Observe the Sabbath day. Now, back in Exodus, it's a different word. What was it back there?
Remember.
Yeah, remember. So you remember it. Here it's a command to observe. Okay. I mean, we would say, well, it's the same thing. If we're being reminded to remember, that means we don't forget it so that we will observe it. But that's a difference. All right. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, on it you shall not do any work. You nor your son, or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any livestock, or the sojourner who is within the gates, so that your male or female servant may rest as well as you. Okay, so almost identical to Exodus. Now, here is one of the major differences between the commandments given in Exodus and the commandments given in Deuteronomy. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. So now there's remembrance here, but it's remembrance that you were a slave. And that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. All right, both of these commandments, both of these sets of 10 commandments, start out, as we have noted, with God saying to them, I have brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, you're my people. Keep my commandments, right? So here, this one follows that trend. And God says, because I brought you out of Egypt, you belong to me. Keep the Sabbath. But back in the book of Exodus, we have remember the Sabbath because God created us. And On the seventh day, he ended his work and rested, like it says, of course, back in the book of Genesis. Therefore, we keep the Sabbath day. The command remains the same. The reason for it differs. But I would submit this to you that the reasoning is not all that different because both in the creation way that is given in Exodus, has ownership of us. And so we remember the Sabbath as an acknowledgement of his ownership of us. And that's true whether you're talking about the people of Israel or if you're talking about, the all of us in general. The principle that God owns us, that enter into a relationship with him. And he owns us whether we enter into that relationship or not. But the idea is that we belong to the Lord. But here he gets very specific about to the people of Israel. So I don't think, to me, there has never been an issue. Now, I know, and I think there may be some truth to this as well. In the second one given in Deuteronomy, it shows that God redeemed them. And so here we have the idea, the concept of redemption built into the Sabbath. Whereas in Exodus, we have God as the creator. But once again, it's sort of the same because God made us in the beginning, but now God is going to recreate us into new creatures by his redemption. But it still raises the issue, which one is the correct one? And why would Moses give different wording here? This is pretty glaring. Some of the other things are just kind of immaterial. But even though the reasoning here may be similar, we can come to a similar conclusion. The reasoning is certainly different. All right? Let's hold on to that for a moment. Honor your father and your mother. The Lord commanded you that your days may be long. I told you the wording actually is different. Once again, I mentioned this a moment ago, also on Sabbath. Here it's actually that days will be added to you. Whereas in Exodus, it'll be long. But here, the translator, by the way, this is a good illustration of what translators do sometimes. The translators here obviously said, we need to make Exodus harmonize with Deuteronomy. So even though we know the words mean something different, let's go ahead and translate exactly the same way so that they harmonize. This is a really good example of that. That's the reason I always say look at different translations and you can pick up on some of those things. All right. And that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, just like in Exodus. All right. Now, let's come to the last commandment. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house or his field or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey, anything is your neighbor's. Do you notice a change here? What's the difference? What's the difference between this commandment
wife comes before house this time?
Oh, now the wife is more valuable than the house. Wow. Okay. Which is interesting. Why was the change made? Why would Moses make this change? And that's pretty intriguing. Do any of you remember the sermon that I had about the woman Noah? And we've covered that here on Wednesday evening as well. Do you remember that? It comes at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where the women now gained significance. Remember? And even though they could not own property, these girls came to Moses and got in his face and said, "Hey, our father had no sons. You need to give us the property. It belongs to us." And well, I don't know about that. Only men can own property, right? But they confronted Moses. And so Moses went up and talked to God. Moses said, "Man, those girls are right. You give the property to them." That was a significant departure. And so maybe we sense a cultural change here. And we see this reflected in the way that Moses related this commandment. Because now there is a descending order still, certainly. But now the wife is more important than any of the other property. She still remains property. Um, and you notice how this is written from a male perspective. It doesn't say, and you shall not covet your neighbor's husband, does it? It's only you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Now, in our minds, we take that and we translate that and we say, okay, you realize the commandments were written for that particular cultural viewpoint. We understand that, right? So, what we say then is that you can easily read this and still be true to the Ten Commandments by saying, and you shall not covet your neighbor's husband, and also you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You can read it both ways, correct? Because today we would recognize that the Ten Commandments were written for women as well as men, wouldn't we? But we
Yes.
definitely see this reflection here in the Ten Commandments, in the structure. So when we recognize that, we say, why was this change made in the status of women from Exodus to Deuteronomy? They've been 40 years in the wilderness, right? And so in that 40 years, there obviously had, it seems to be, a cultural shift of some way. Now, when Moses gives this, he reorders the order. And he says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his house or his male servant, female servant. The rest of it remains the same. It's only the wife now that has status as the highest on the highest list, the highest position in the list of property. So these are some cultural things that we see in the Ten Commandments. Now, I think that we have to ask ourselves, if God gave the Ten Commandments today, would the way that they are worded be different? And I think we have to say absolutely they would be different. I think all of us recognize that because otherwise the Ten Commandments would only apply to the men. But in that society, the men owned everything, they were in control of everything, and the women had to do what they were told to do. Now, we recognize and we know that in a practical way, that wasn't true. But the cultural view is what it still remains the same. So, I mean, we can read the Bible stories and we can see that women did not always bow down and worship the men. Well, I mean, we know that, but culturally, it was that that kind of thing, and we do see that reflected in places. Sarah, for instance, called Abraham Lord. Uh, you know, I mean, if any woman today called her husband Lord, we would want her to go in for counsel, wouldn't we? No? Okay.
I
Anyway,
think it means more like husband. It's more like a woman saying, husband, do this or do that.
well, yeah, but it really is it's a title of authority.
It
Um,
is. It is.
yeah,
But then so is
and
husband to me.
yeah, there might be those that would debate that with you, Rita. Maybe it's a title of relationship, uh,
I,
but
I have a
that's a different society.
I have a thought,
Okay,
if it's okay. Um,
sure.
is this the Ten Commandments as written in Exodus were put down, this is it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's it. Spelled out, clear, no extra comments.
Mhm.
Now we are moving into history. Moses is speaking to the people of his time. It
Mhm.
may be that, well, in the wilderness, what did they own as far as houses? Tents.
Mhm.
What might the men have been doing that they had no business doing when they looked at someone else's wife? And that might have changed the position that Moses was addressing the the law, but as it applied to that group of people at that time. Just like you said, if we were to read the Ten Commandments as written for today's people, it would be different. It's like we know that the law says don't speed,
Mm-hmm.
and you got a sign to tell you it's 45 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get pulled over and you're going 50, the police officer is not going to quote you the law. He's going to say, "Lady, do you know what you were doing? And let me tell you what's going to happen because you broke the law. You're getting a ticket." So it's the law versus the application of the law.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The With the Ten Commandments, the commandments, and I mentioned this in passing Sabbath too, but the Ten Commandments are written in the second person masculine. So there's no question in Hebrew that these commandments were all addressed to men. Now, we wouldn't do that today. We would address the Ten Commandments to everyone, right? Not just to men. And we would reflect that in the rest of the wording. Like, it wouldn't just be directed to a man, don't covet somebody else's wife. But in that culture, that was property, and the man was in charge. So, it was written from that perspective. But today we look at this and we would say, yeah, that would apply to a woman as well, not to covet someone's husband. Um, and so we would see these commandments, of course, today as being applicable to both men and women, not just to men. And so I think we have to see in the Ten Commandments, we have to recognize that this is the center of what God has instructed by way of our behavior. And I think all of us understand that. But at the same time, we have to realize the wording reflects the people to whom these commandments were being addressed. And
That's my point.
yeah, okay, good. We're on the same wavelength then. Okay,
Um,
so yeah, please go ahead.
no, I have a question, but I'll hold it for later.
Okay.
But Steve,
Huh?
when I think of the commandments, I don't think of the explanation that follows them as being part of the commandment necessarily. Like,
Yeah.
remember the Sabbath day for in 6 days, did God write it on those tablets?
David, that's an interesting.
I mean, do you think he wrote that much on the tablets of stone?
What you have posed is an interesting question. It has been discussed tremendously. Way back years ago, when I was in seminary, I actually took one of the classes there. They had an Old Testament scholar. The guy was really pretty brilliant. But I took a class entitled The Ten Commandments. And anyway, so this certainly was a discussion. Of course, at that point, I didn't realize that the Ten Commandments weren't called the commandments; they were called 10 words.
Yeah, that's right. You told us that a while ago.
Yeah. So, 10 words. What does that actually mean? Uh, I don't know because what can you express with one word? I mean, even Hebrew does not have words so complete that you only need to say one word. Um,
When we refer to the Bible, we say the word, but that's a group of words.
Correct. Well, that comes from the Greek logos, and which we translate word, uh, which is kind of interesting in itself. I said, well, the word Bible comes from biblos, which is actually Latin, not Greek, but logos is the word um, is uh, is logos, which in Greek has a lot more connotation than just speaking. That's the reason John could say the word became flesh. In our mind, we think of words, printed out words. That's not what John's talking about at all. He's talking about the Greek concept of logos, which is really different. This is some of the problem that we get in translation and understanding from these ancient societies, exactly understanding in the way that that we want the Lord to have us understand things. But so there are always challenges. All right, let's go. This is Deuteronomy 5:22. So you can see we're coming down just a little bit now in the chapter. These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly in the mountain out of the midst of fire, and the cloud and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. I should have highlighted that because that's really what I wanted to talk about. He added no more. Now, to me, I think that is extremely important. So now Moses goes over, reiterates the Ten Commandments, changes the phraseology a little bit, but then he says to them, listen, that's all God did. There are 10. He did not add any more to this. And I think that is really important. I think we need to recognize in that the Ten Commandments are different than all the other Mosaic laws that were given. And I think we see this here in this verse. And then I'll go in here just a moment, just a little bit more in this chapter. But I think it's important for us to recognize it. And as Adventists, we have, and most Christian denominations, most Protestant denominations have recognized the difference here. And when we come to the New Testament, we find, for instance, Paul in the book of Romans. Paul says, I would not have known sin except the law said, you shall not covet. So he's quoting the Ten Commandments. And he focuses that on the issue of sin, not on all the other things. We know specifically that Paul took all of those other writings of Moses that related to circumcision, to the sacrifice, to all the other regulations. And Paul just set those aside. I mean, that's clear in the writings of Paul. And we have the same thing happening in the Council of Jerusalem, at least as it related to Gentile Christians. It was more controversial among the Jewish Christians. But I think we see here God making a real distinguishing between the Ten Commandments and all these other laws. So he said, this is what God says, I gave, and I did not add any more to this. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. So Moses said, God only gave 10. That was it. You have heard me say repeatedly that God makes it simple. I mean, we never understand fully the depth of the Ten Commandments, right? All of us understand that. But on the surface, no one that has the brains to get up and function in society can misunderstand the Ten Commandments, right? They're clear as can be. We understand that. But here, God made it simple. And he says to Moses, that's it. So what God wanted his people to do, he wanted them to observe the Ten Commandments. And he wanted them to do it so that they would have a prosperous life, they would have a good society. And of course, they messed up big time. And they didn't keep Ten Commandments or anything else. All right. Now we're going down to verses 27 and 29. You still see we're here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Go near and hear all that the Lord will say. So what God told them, he says, you go tell the people to go back to their tent. I'm done with them. They have the Ten Commandments. Moses said that to them. That's it. God's not giving you any more. Now this is interesting. So God says to Moses now, he says, Moses, I want to chat a little bit more with you. Get the people out of here. I want to talk with you a little bit more. Go near and hear all that Yahweh our God will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear it and do it. By the way, that was the response the people gave. This is a response, first of all. And the Lord heard the words when he spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I've heard these words of the people. They have spoken to you. They are right, and they have spoken. Remember, this was an agreement. We've talked about that. They entered into agreement with God. On that day, they had such a heart as this always to fear me and to keep my commandments, that it may go well with them and their descendants. So the response here initially to God telling them, you only have these 10, keep these. This is our agreement. And the people said, okay, that's good. We're going to do that. And God says, oh, I hope that you'll have that heart always with you, that you'll keep these 10 commandments and that it will go well with you and your descendants forever. All right. So now we move on to the other part. Moses sent them home. And he says, but you stand here, Moses, by me, and I will tell you the whole commandment of the statutes and rules that you shall teach them, that they may do them in the land that I'm giving them to possess. Now, notice this, that God said to Moses, tell the people these 10 commandments. That's it. There is no more. Moses said that very clearly. There are no more. And yet God tells him to stay here, and I'm going to give you other regulations. So we ask ourselves, of course, why did God do that? And I think, to me, the answer is very simple. That God had given the people the what really mattered, and the rest of it was superfluous in many ways and changeable. Because as society developed, Rita, you mentioned that these things were originally given out of the wilderness, but once they got into the promised land, a lot of those things changed because now they had an established society. And so we see that. We're not going to go through all of that, but we see that reflected in these regulations that we have back in the Old Testament. So many of these things change. And so here we see the difference that God said there are 10 and no more. And now he says to Moses, by the way, let me give you some other regulations. So he tells Moses, okay, you tell the people that, when they go out to defecate, to take a shovel so they can bury it. And he gives those kinds of regulations, which make a lot of sense. But what God was really after by way of the legal agreement between him and his people was simply the 10, and there were no more. And the rest of these were changeable statutes that had to do with society. Some of them had to do with the sacrificial system as well, we know. But this is what we see changing in the New Testament, that all of these things. Now, the apostles look at these and Paul looked at these and said, that's no more. But they never related that this is no more attitude to the 10 Commandments. It was always the 10 Commandments were there. They were to be observed. The rest of it, don't worry about it. This is why we get into problems as Adventists sometimes. Not that we can't learn from some of these regulations. We can learn things from them, by the way. But to try to make those obligatory laws, we get into trouble on that. And you've heard me say that before. We have to be really, really careful. And that's why you will never hear me take the issue of clean and unclean foods and present that as a legal obligation. I'll present it as something that says, hey, listen, the Lord gave this guidance. Maybe this is good to listen to. And you do have the idea going back to the flood, with Noah, the clean and the unclean, even though it's not defined at that point. And that gives you a little bit more to rely on. But we have to be extremely careful, because once you start making all of these others that God separated out equal to the 10 Commandments, then you're in trouble. And you have a lot of explaining to do. So, any case, be that as it may, I hope you understand me, but don't misunderstand me on that. By the way, here's something. This is in 2011, so it's a few years ago, but it's not all that old. Cardinal O'Malley in Boston said the 10 Commandments are not up for grabs. And that was reported in the Boston Globe. However, this is from the Catechism of the Boston Diocese that he was in charge of. And so even though he says the 10 Commandments are not up for grabs, all of us know that they've been changed. This is really, by the way, the different catechisms have these a little bit differently, but they're pretty close. That's something that many Adventists don't recognize and know. But there's not a Catholic catechism. There are a lot of different Catholic catechisms, and they are different. Bishops have different ones, but they're all really similar in this, in that they drop the second commandment and they divide the last commandment in two in order to get 10. So it was kind of curious. Here you have this guy making a stand saying the 10 commandments are not negotiable, and then he goes right out and changes them, drops the Sabbath out of it altogether. drops leaves in, remember the Lord's Day, as you see there. And then he drops the second commandment out entirely. And then he has, he's able to go out and he's able to say, well, the 10 Commandments are not negotiable. Yeah, we would agree with you on that statement, but why do you change them and do them your own way? But he does. Okay, now let's come back to something, David, you mentioned earlier, and I think something that we need to discuss. We don't have a lot of time left here, but what is in the 10 Commandments? What is relevant and obligatory? Anybody want to jump in on that? Okay,
If this
but
isn't a
David,
trick
this
question,
could,
I think it means nothing's negotiable. This is it.
yeah, and Rita, this goes back to I think what David said earlier, and that's the reason I mentioned that is that while you see in the Sabbath, for instance, the reason for keeping the Sabbath is different from one table of the commandments to the other one, Moses changed that part. He changed the explanation, but he did not change the command, did he?
No.
In the same way in coveting, even though he changed the order, he did not change the command.
The command usually came first, and then the explanation came later. And the command is actually the commandment. I mean, that phrase.
Right. So which set of the commandments between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, which one's the real one? Both of them.
Both.
Yeah.
Good
Because the
question.
commands remain the same.
Trick question.
Yeah. There's no difference in the commands, right?
Right.
Okay. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. And I debated whether or not to throw this in, but you might run. I mean, we dig in deep here on Wednesday evening, don't we? And let me stop the screen share and do another screen share with you. And I'm just going to throw this out there for your interest. We're not going to deal with this at length, but let me do a different screen share. And this is Exodus 34. Okay. And this is just the Bible that I have up here at this point rather than different passages. But the Lord said to Moses, now notice this is Exodus 34. This is a long way after Exodus 20. The Lord said to Moses, cut yourself 2 tables like the first, and I will write on the tables the words that were on the tablets which you broke, the first tablets that you broke. Okay. Now we know this story. Verse 4 down here. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first, and he rose up early in the morning, went up to Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. Then the God comes down in a cloud, and we see some similar language here as what we have in the 10 Commandments, but we have different things here. Here we know in verse 7, keeping steadfast love for thousands, giving iniquity and transgression. I will not clear the guilty of the fathers and the children of the 3rd and 4th generation. That sounds like part of the 10 Commandments, right? The wording here is really similar. And then you go down to verse 10, and he says, behold, I'm making a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as I have created the earth. Created in all the earth, and all the people among them shall see the work of the Lord. Once again, God is presented here as the creator. We come down here, for you shall worship no other God, for he's a jealous God. Now remember, Moses is up there with the new set of tablets, right? The new stone. And so then we have this immediately following. You shall not make for yourself any god of cast metal. Sounds just like 10 Commandments. First of all, not to have any other gods. Second of all, you're not to have a graven image. But then we have a curve thrown in here. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. Okay, because you came out of Egypt. Remember the two that we looked at in Exodus 20 and Exodus 5 both start out with the idea that God it makes these obligatory on them because he delivered them out of Egypt. And then in the second one in Deuteronomy, that's the reason for keeping the Sabbath as well. Well, here we see it in this chain of things that are given after Moses is up there on Mount Sinai with the tablet. Uh, and there are a lot of similarities here to the Ten Commandments, but there are some differences. Here's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but the reason is that I rescued you out of Egypt. And then you come down here to verse 21, 6 days you'll work, on the seventh you shall rest, and plow and harvest you shall rest. Okay, the Sabbath commandment in very simple form. You shall observe the Feast of Weeks and so forth. 3 times a year, your male shall appear before me. We don't see that in the Ten Commandments, but we see it here. So you have the Sabbath commandment here, but then you have, oh, yeah, okay, here's some other things. And no one shall covet. So here we have the commandment. I don't have that highlighted, but here the you not to covet. But here we have a thing about the sacrifices and so forth. And then the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance to these words, I've made a covenant with you in Israel. So here we have the idea of covenant coming back. Well, we have seen both in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, God was making a covenant with his people. There were 10, there were no more. That was it. And this was the covenant God made. But when we come back here to Exodus 34, it seems like maybe there are some other things that are being thrown in. So Moses was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. Remember, he has a second table up there. He didn't eat bread or water. He wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant of the Ten Commandments. So go back up to verse 27. The Lord said to Moses, write these words. Well, what are these words? The things that we just read. So he goes up to there, and then God says these things, and then God says, write these, for these are the covenant with you in Israel. So, and I'm going to write them back on the tablet just like I did the first tablet. So he was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights, eating of the bread and water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. Then when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, with the 2 tablets of testimony in his hand, he came down from the mountain. Moses did not know, the skin of his face shone and so forth, and he had to veil his face. We know the story. Okay, so some have said, okay, look, Moses went up there with the second table, and then what we have following that is God re-giving the Ten Commandments, but given in different words, and then Moses comes down with it written on a tablet. I don't think that's really what's happening here, but there is a lot of scholarly debate over this issue. When Moses in Deuteronomy said there are 10 and that's it, and I just now gave them to you, to me, that's pretty straightforward. I think what we have here is kind of like commentary and some extra things that are being thrown in to the established 10 Commandments. And that is things that related to particulars that relate just to the people of Israel for that particular time. So I don't see this as a re-giving of 10 Commandments here. I see this more as kind of a commentary that were appropriate for that particular circumstance and that particular time. Because once again, we go to Deuteronomy, it's very clear. There are only 10, here they are, makes them very clear. And they match up with what we have in Leviticus 20. But there are some that try to divide these into 10 commandments. They go down through here and say, here's number 1, here's number 2. There are a lot of similarities. And it was given at a time when God was writing the 10 commandments. But like I said, I think it's more commentary that relates to that particular time and that particular juncture. The 10 commandments stand apart. They are separate, as we've already seen in Deuteronomy. They stand by themselves. And the other regulations are not obligatory. We should never try to make them obligatory on Christians today. And as I've said, not that we can't learn some things from them, we can, but they're not obligatory. But the 10 commandments are. God has never changed that. And there are a lot of people like Cardinal O'Malley that gave lip service to the 10 commandments today, still give lip service, but go on and change them the way they want them to be. But the commands never change. So there's only, the 10 commandments that are made clear in Deuteronomy and in Exodus, as we've already mentioned, both are valid, and both are the 10 commandments. All right. Sorry, I know I ran through that really fast because I knew we were running out of time. But we can take just a little extra time, maybe. I don't want to impose on you. But if anybody has any observations or questions, please go ahead.
Steve, uh, Jesus came along and he was the rich young ruler or somebody was asked, he said, what does the law say? And
Mhm.
he said a lot of the what we were just looking at. But
Mhm.
then Jesus talked more about the spirit of the law than the letter of the law. You know, like what your thoughts are, what you're thinking. Where they never thought that probably for many years,
Mhm.
even when they were given. So, you know, did people understand that part back in the Old Testament times?
Yeah, David, and I think that's an excellent point. We know from the writings in the New Testament how extremely legalistic these people were.
Yeah.
And going back to Sabbath, remember I mentioned the thing, and all of us know that too, where children did not have to honor their parents. And I won't go over the sermon Sabbath, you remember that, but that uh,
I wasn't there.
they
I'm
got
sorry.
out of it. What's that?
I wasn't there. I'm sorry if I.
Oh, yeah, I mentioned that the word honor is really that's a bad translation. It's a difficult word to translate. Don't want to go back through all of that. You can go online and listen to it if you want to. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I'll
the
have to go
point,
online and listen to it.
yeah, the point that I was making is that Jesus, uh, recognized how legalistic this was, and like you said, David, what Jesus really wanted was a heart relationship where these things were done willingly, not from a legalistic standpoint where people tried to compound laws and twist their way out of it. I mean, all of us know. I mean, we have the greatest legal system in the world. I'm talking about, in the U.S. And I think all of us are grateful and thankful for that. But all of us know how easily different laws can go against each other and be twisted. And this is the Pharisees in the day of Jesus. I mean, they were extraordinary at this. And Jesus wanted to get beyond all of that craziness. And Jesus said, if you love your neighbor as you love yourself, then you don't need a list, right? Nobody needs anything written down. If you have the attitude, I love my neighbor as I love myself, you don't need a list. You understand what that means,
But I think
right?
when they were given that they had just come out of slavery
Hmm.
and they were used to taking commands, from their slave owners and everything, slave
Hmm.
drivers, and that's the only way you could reach them
Hmm.
is in a concrete manner. You couldn't you couldn't reach them with the spirit of the law. You just had to give them God had to give them just spell it out.
Hmm.
And so I can't blame them in a way. I probably would have done the same thing, uh,
Yeah.
taking it literally and legalistically.
Yeah.
Uh,
But God really wants us to have a heart relationship to it. Uh,
right.
what does it mean to love the neighbors as self? That's the reason Jesus said all the commandments are summed up in those two simple statements.
Mhm.
Now, the Ten Commandments give us a little more definition, and I've said this on Sabbath morning a number of times, but a lot of the Ten Commandments just follow from natural law. We understand that. Um, Sane, rational people don't go out and murder. I mean, they just don't do that. It takes crazy people or people that know they're doing something wrong and they want to do it anyway. Uh, but the sane, rational people know that's wrong. So it's not hard to understand. Um,
Yeah. I think we're in a way we're inborn with knowing there's a difference if something's wrong, even if we don't aren't aware of the Ten Commandments. I think that we can sense if something's wrong.
mhm. Yeah,
You
exactly.
know, even people that don't believe in God will say, "Well, that's not right." I mean, you
Hmm.
can't do that, and they
Yeah.
can't give any reason necessarily. They just come to that conclusion.
Hmm.
I think I read
Right.
that C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity. I think that's what one thing he emphasized.
Yeah. I mean, what kind of world would it be if we loved our neighbors ourselves? Yeah. if everybody did that. And that's really the kind of world God wants to have, you know, the new earth.
Amen.
Mm.
I have a
Well,
quick
any
question.
other?
I have a quick
Sure,
question.
please.
The phrase "within thy gates."
Uh-huh.
Uh, define that, please. What are the gates? Where are the gates? Is that your city? Is that
Yeah.
your home? Is that the world?
I always thought it was the home, within your home.
I
What
did
if you rent?
too. I did too, but
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no,
I
no,
was just giving I was just giving Mary a hard time. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rita.
no, I agree. I agree with Mary. I always thought it meant your home, but I've heard people say no. It's talking about the gates. Literally the gates of the city. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
Well,
Well,
when
I
the
you can
Ten
think
only
Commandments were given,
you
they
can
had
only
no city.
control what's within your home. You can't
Yeah.
control outside of that, in my opinion.
Right. Well, when the Ten Commandments were given, they didn't have cities.
aha.
Um, you know, so yeah, I mean, what does it mean within the gates? That's an interesting question. Maybe back in Egypt, they did have homes back in Egypt. They probably had gates, and so they could relate to the concept, but they were living out in the wilderness in tents at that particular time.
So it would
Um,
mean within your personal property,
well, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be employing people on Sabbath, right? I
right?
mean, yeah, you can apply that to a whole bunch of things. You own a business, you don't employ them on Sabbath. Um,
Well, I guess the reason that I'm asking that is because in talking once in a while with non-Adventist friends, the question comes up, um, would you eat out? Would you shop? Would you, of course I know what I would do, but how does it apply to
mhm.
those situations?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I think that everyone has to leave it up to their individual conscience, um, and everybody looks at these things differently, and they have different uh, viewpoint. You've heard me say on Sabbath morning, if and you go back to the experience of Jesus and the disciples gathering grain on the Sabbath, were
Right.
they in
If you're
technical
if you're
violation?
if
Sure.
you're hungry, eat.
Yeah, but they were hungry. And
Yeah.
that's what I've said. If I'm out on Sabbath and I'm gonna find some food, you know,
Right.
uh, if I don't have some food with me, I'm gonna get some. Um, but
Well,
there are others that relate to that differently. I can tell you a story. I don't know if any of you remember Don Snyder. He passed away not that long ago, but a little while ago, a couple years ago. But he was the president of our church for the North American division, vice president of the General Conference. And so Don and I, one time, we were in New York City, and so he wanted to rush out before sundown, and he wanted to get some apples and a couple things so that he could get through the Sabbath. And um, I so I mean I was with him, so I did it his way. But I can tell you a lot of other times I didn't do it his way. I say it's Sabbath, I need a decent meal. I'm going to go get something to eat. Um, but once again, I don't know that. I think we have to do our individual conscience on these kinds of things. And it's just like let's say buying gas on Sabbath. I mean, we all come across these things, and we have to make a decision. I've shared this story before. You may not remember it, but the first district I had as a pastor, I had two. They gave me two churches, and then I started two new churches. And the two new churches just happened to be 100 miles apart. And
whew,
I would go, well, in order to keep those churches going, they had to have leadership there. First of all, there were two new churches, and the others were fairly small churches, and so I went to three churches a Sabbath. Well, the
yeah.
car I had, I could not make it to three churches on Sabbath. So I can tell you what I did. You can condemn me or whatever, but I thought, okay, well, I don't want to buy gas where church members are going to see me because they might misunderstand. So I would choose a station out in the middle of nowhere, a gas station, pay more money for the gas on Sabbath so I could buy gas and make it to the churches. All right. Now, there may have been
I
some others
totally
that
get
wouldn't have
that.
done that. What's that?
Yeah.
Look, we
I
live.
remember, I remember a particular Sabbath when I got a call from a lady a deaconess in the church. This is when I was head deaconess years and years and years ago in Raleigh. And she said, I forgot that this is the Sabbath for the Lord's Supper, and I didn't make the bread yesterday. So we just call the pastor and tell him we're not having it. And oh yeah, I sure will do that. So a couple of us
Oh,
got busy and baked the bread and did what we had to do so that we could have it. And I didn't feel guilty. I mean,
right.
but that was a serious issue to her, and she could not
Mhm.
do it. And I can't fault her for it because that's her conviction. It's
Mhm.
silly to me, but it wasn't to her.
Right. Well, I do think that we need to keep the principle in mind while we want to be conscious that we keep the Sabbath appropriately. At the same time, we have to realize that the main principle of the Sabbath is mercy. And that's what Jesus tried to stress with his disciples. And the Pharisee got upset, and Jesus said, You don't tell me about this. I made the day. I made the Sabbath, you
Right.
know? He says, if you had known what mercy meant, you'd have gone back and read the Old Testament about how David broke the law in order to show mercy. His soldiers were hungry, went and ate the showbread out of the temple.
Absolutely. Well, I think,
So,
in my opinion, just my opinion, but I think those things that we can avoid doing on the Sabbath that we can do on another day, we do.
mhm,
But
absolutely.
but if we can't avoid it for whatever reason, the ox is in the ditch, we
Mhm.
do it.
Right. Yeah, I think we need to be careful about keeping the Sabbath, but not legalistic.
Right. Right. Okay. One other question in this area. Um, about eating in restaurants.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, Herschel and I never did on the Sabbath. We just didn't. We didn't fault anybody else that did.
Mhm.
Um, and one member, and then we came to First Church, and a lot more people ate out. I know this is comparing two churches, but I think one was a little more conservative than the other. And so I was talking with a good friend at the church, and said, "Oh, I'm surprised so many people eat out on the Sabbath." Um, and he said, "Well, we're not making them work; they're already at work." So
I
Yeah,
don't know about that.
those are
See,
those are ar- these are arguments that I choose not to get into
I
because
totally understand.
it's a bottomless
I
pit.
get it.
Uh, the if you buy gas on the Sabbath and you only put your card in the machine, you don't hand it to a person.
Right.
You follow what I'm saying? Yeah, it's you know there's a reason that I said we want to be careful about the Sabbath, but not legalistic, and we have to allow people their own conscience to be their guide of these things. And I mean, I've had not many people open their homes anymore. It used to be, in fact, I was just talking to my brother. My brother's picked up this really difficult job of pastoring this very broken church there by Andrews University. And he was retired. They asked him to come out of retirement and do that. Some of you may have heard the story, but in any case, so you know, he's he's there uh, pastoring this church, and um, you know, you just on some of these things, if you go into a place that I've started to tell you something, I have to be careful because this is being recorded. Okay, so that's stumbling that too a little bit. But in any case, we have to be careful about the Sabbath, but not 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 legalistic about it. We have to let love apply and know the Lord will sort all of this out. I've had members here, and I've done it at times that would say to me, once again, people don't open their homes much anymore, and that's where I started to tell you a story about my brother. But I'll let that go. But it's the reality. People just don't open their homes. Uh, there used to be a lot of pastoral visitation, but uh, I've tried that with elders in several churches where we divide the family up, ask them to make appointments. I'll go with them to visit. And people, people just don't have others in their homes anymore very much. Some do, but not many. And in any case, so, I've
And
had members
you can't
invite.
go a whole day without eating. But
No,
I don't want,
I've had members invite me.
I
Yeah, I had
don't,
members invite me, say, look, would you go over here and eat with us? So they don't invite me home, they invite me to go eat with them. So I've done that on Sabbath. But
yeah.
I don't
And
do that
well,
routinely.
I don't want to leave the impression that Herschel and I never, we did not eat on the Sabbath, in the early days out of choice, but we did eat every Sabbath, out after church when, uh, well, I was getting older, he was getting older, and it was easier. It was
Yeah,
just easier. And so
absolutely.
I don't want to leave the impression that, oh no, we never ate on the same. We didn't in the early years when we were healthy and we could do something about it. And then it just was, but I don't like to go into a noisy place that has music going and all that kind of stuff.
Right,
It demeans the I feel like I am abusing the Sabbath then if I'm in that
right.
kind of place for lunch.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. I certainly understand that. Well, last week we only went for about 30 or 40 minutes, and so we made up for tonight. How's that?
Thank you for answering our questions.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you for your patience. And why don't we just have prayer since we're so far over time here, and we'll close out this evening. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity to study together, to discuss these things that are important, so important to us. We ask you, Lord, that you'll help us to be faithful to you. Uh, we ask also, Lord, that you'll help us to be merciful in our understanding towards others. So we ask, Father, that you will give us clarity of thought and direction in our lives. We all want to live for you. We want to honor you in this world. And we just ask you that you will be with us, impress us, and guide us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 All
Thank
right. Well,
you.
hey, thanks. Have a good night. Thanks for being here.
Night night.
All right.
Night.
Good
See
night.
you on Sabbath.
Okay.